Hi, my name is Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute here at WSU, and on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event this evening. Before I get started, I just have a couple of quick announcements and some thank yous to get out of the way. If you're here for the Common Reading program or for some class, there'll be sign-up sheets afterwards out in the lobby, so go out there. And also after the event, we're going to be having a book signing. That will be inside the room here over on that side if you're interested in purchasing one of Kurt Andersen's books and having him autograph it for you. Let me thank our co-sponsors for tonight's event. They include the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs here at WSU, the Departments of History and the Departments of English here at WSU. And let me also recognize our dean, our new dean, Matt Jockers from the College of Arts and Sciences, and thank the college for their continued support of the Foley Institute and our programs. So for those of you who don't know much about the Foley Institute, we were established here in 1995 at WSU to honor the service of Thomas S. Foley, who served in Congress for 30 years representing the 5th Congressional District, and when he left Congress was Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, and later went on to become the U.S. Ambassador to Japan. And to recognize his legacy, we do a number of things here at WSU. We try to get students involved in careers in public service, and we do that primarily through internships in Washington, D.C., and Olympia, and elsewhere. We also have a mission of educating the public about the function of democratic institutions and about public policy and public affairs. And that's what leads us to host these types of events. So one of the best parts of my job is when I read an article or I read a book that I think's really interesting, I can go, I want to bring that author to campus so I can talk to them more and find out more of what they're thinking about. And that's precisely what happened in this case. I read Kurt's book last year when it came out, and it was one of the most entertaining and most insightful reads I'd had in a long time. I gave it to my wife. She loved it. She says it changed the way she thought about all sorts of things in American public life, including why women dye their hair. So you'll have to find out about that from Kurt later. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you tonight Kurt Andersen. Kurt is a best-selling author, a journalist, a cultural critic, a media entrepreneur, and the host of Public Radio Studio 360. After graduating from Harvard University, where he served as the editor of the Harvard Lampoon, Kurt began a career in writing and journalism. At various points in his career, he's been a columnist or a contributor at the New York Times, Vanity Fair, New York Magazine, The Atlantic, Time Magazine, and The New Yorker. In 1986, Kurt, together with Graydon Carter, co-founded Spy Magazine, which transformed journalism through its satirical look at America's media and entertainment industries and its mocking of high society. In 2004, Kurt also oversaw the relaunch of Bennington's Colors magazine. In addition to writing for film, television, and the stage, Kurt created and hosts Studio 360, a cultural magazine show broadcast on more than 200 radio stations with 1 million listeners, and which has been the recipient of 2 Peabody Awards. Kurt's novels have included bestsellers such as Heyday, Turn of the Century, and True Believers. His nonfiction books have included The Real Thing, which was published by the University of Nebraska in 1980, Reset, How the Crisis Can Restore Our Values and Renew America, which was a New York Times bestseller published by Random House in 2009, and his most recent book, published last year by Random House, also a New York Times bestseller, and the subject of tonight's talk, Fantasyland, How America Went Haywire, a 500-year history. Kurt's going to speak for about 45 minutes, he says, and then after that we'll open up for Q&A. I'm going to ask you if you have questions to come to one of the 2 microphones up front here and just line up behind if someone's already there. Join me now in welcoming Kurt Andersen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here among you in one of the widest rooms to which I've ever spoken, but I'll try to move my head back and forth, and it's a good thing that I have a mic on my lapel as a result. Yeah, I have been I do a lot of different kinds of writing, and my last several books have been novels. And I had this notion for a nonfiction book that I thought I would do after I finished the novel I had started. But my publisher, when I described it to her and said, I think I might do this eventually, this was 5 years ago now, she said, no, that sounds very timely. And we had no idea how timely it would become. And I'm glad I took her suggestion and went ahead with it. It's a nonfiction book, and it's a history, it's a strange revisionist history of America that I've been thinking about a long time, and as I say, began writing in 2014. The timing of that becomes relevant as you find out as I talk to you about what it is about, and so it's a big book, and really its subtitle is How America Went Haywire: A 500-Year History, in my 45 minutes tonight, or this afternoon, I don't have time to give you the full 500 years, but I hope I'll give a lot of it and a distillation of it. And if you're interested in reading more, you may. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have as you were promised. So, back in 1770, way before he was president of the United States, 20 years before there was a United States, John Adams, as some of you may know, served as a defense lawyer at the trial of the British soldiers who were on trial for murder, for killing John Adams' fellow patriots in the Boston Massacre. At that trial, Adams made, I think, the first statement that is still his first famous statement. He said, "Facts are stubborn things, and our wishes and inclinations and the dictates of our passions do not alter the state of facts and evidence." One of the premise really of my Fantasyland idea of America is that 2.5 centuries later, this nation that John Adams co-founded is in danger of becoming a refutation of that principle, that facts are stubborn things. As a great American leader of my lifetime, and in fact a colleague of Thomas Foley, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to say, there we are. I can't see it, but I assume that's Daniel Patrick Moynihan's quote. "You're entitled to your own opinion, but you are not entitled to your own facts." Now, he was a good-humored man and was kind of joking, but not really. Because he understood as he began saying this in the 1980s and 90s, and a friend of mine was one of his chief aides at the time, said that's when he started saying it, told me that. It's because he saw what was starting to happen in the United States, that people were confusing facts and opinions. And here we are today with many, many millions of Americans who really do feel entitled to their own facts as well as to their own opinions, and don't see any real difference between fact and opinion, and feel free to deny any realities that they find inconvenient or troubling. Now, each of us is on a spectrum somewhere between rational and irrational. We've all got hunches that we can't prove and superstitions that don't necessarily make any sense. What is problematic, and what Americans have been doing more and more, is going overboard, letting subjective belief and feelings entirely override empirical observation and factual understandings. What I'm talking about is not unique to America, people treating real life or parts of real life as fantasy and fantasies as reality, denying important evidence and taking preposterous ideas seriously. We are just uniquely immersed and extreme in the developed world, in the rich world, compared to Canada or Great Britain or Australia and the 24 nations of Europe and Japan. Our predilection in so many different ways is so deep-seated and extreme and really different than other advanced countries in the breadth and depth of our embrace of fantasies and falsehoods of lots of different kinds. Take, for instance, and this is why I said I started writing this in 2014, Donald Trump. Now, I disagree with and disapprove of a lot of the policies he pushes and his ugly instincts and his unfortunate manner. But to me, and it's the subject of this book that I started writing before he was anywhere really on the political landscape, the big problem for this country, and I think a lasting problem, is that he's leading a movement based on complete indifference to what is provable and true and what is wishful and false. There's this problem. The Washington Post keeps this running fact-checked tally of all the falsehoods and misleading statements he puts out as president. It reached 5,000 3 weeks ago, and it has recently and rapidly been getting worse. When he was first in office a year and a half ago, Donald Trump was publicly lying or dissembling an average of 5 times a day. This year, that rate more than doubled to a dozen falsehoods a day. And starting just this past summer, the summer we've just finished, the gusher of falsehoods increased to an average of 15 a day. And just since I've been preparing to come here to talk to you, the first 2 weeks of September, it doubled to 32 falsehoods and misleading claims per day. But my point this afternoon is not Donald Trump so much, but rather what people are calling the post-factual and post-truth America didn't start with Donald Trump's candidacy 3 years ago or 7 years ago when he entered politics meaningfully and started his political career based on the fantasy that President Obama was born in a foreign country. No, Trump is really someone who simply took very, very shrewd advantage of what America had become, our what I believe to be our lowered resistance to untruths and fantasies. Last year, a guy I've become friendly with lately, the conservative radio talk show host Charlie Sykes, explained in an article how that happened, or part of how that happened. He confessed his own part in the process. He said that, quote, by hammering the mainstream media for its bias and double standards for decades, he had helped, quote, destroy much of the right's immunity to false information. Now, the left is not immune to false information either, but it has been, and as I think we're seeing now, much more problematic on the right. One of my own aha moments about this came back in 2002. President Bush's mastermind, political mastermind, Karl Rove, told a New York Times reporter that people like the reporter, people, quote, in the reality-based community, which was a phrase he coined in that article, Karl Rove, the reality-based community believes that solutions emerge from the judicious study of discernible reality. That's not the way the world really works anymore. He said all this with a smile, but he was deadly serious. And he went on. We create our own reality, and while you're studying that reality judiciously, as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too, and that's how things will sort out. And you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do. But at that moment in the early 2000s, what I call full Fantasyland had really just blossomed during the 90s and at the turn of this century. But the journey that took us here, that took us there and took us here is much, much longer than that, which is why my book, as I say, is a 500-year history, which, as I also said, I started working some serious time before Donald Trump was anywhere on the political landscape. My point about him being, and I'm not going to mention him much more tonight, or for at least a half an hour, he is a remarkable symptom of a chronic American condition and predisposition. He's not the cause of it. To understand what's happening, we need to follow historical threads, I think, all the way back to America's beginnings, because this post-truth present is just the extreme extrapolation and expression of a whole package of attitudes and instincts that have made America exceptional, for better as well as for worse, for its entire history. So, think about the very beginning, around 1600. The first English colonists here were all believers in this highly individualistic, anti-establishment, anti-Catholic, new species of Christianity that was Protestantism. It was less than 100 years old when those English people first came to the New World. In England, Protestantism had spun off a more fervent, extreme subspecies called Puritanism, the Puritans, and then a subspecies of even more fervent zealots, the separating Puritans, which in turn spit out another smaller, super extreme subset whom we know as the Pilgrims, who sailed across the Atlantic and started creating our America. Now, in Europe, the Middle Ages at that time had ended a century earlier. The Age of Reason was fully underway, Shakespeare and Galileo and Isaac Newton and René Descartes being among its leaders. And belief in biblical end-of-the-world prophecies and satanic forces on earth today were fading fast in Europe, but not among the extreme Puritan cult, and they were indeed a cult who moved to the New World wilderness. They took the Bible as literally as they could. They really believed in imminent end times back in the early 1600s, thought that Native Americans were Satan's minions, and that Satan had also was turning some of their own fellow colonists into witches. Now, certain ultra-Protestant ways of thinking and feeling became defining American habits of mind. And I don't mean just the religious particulars at all, or the things that most people agree were good, like the Protestant work ethic. I mean the founding Protestant approach to kind of an extreme antagonism to the establishment, to all establishments, and sometimes to reasonableness itself, and the self-righteousness. To me, the deepest and most enduring influence of that founding American Protestant ethos has been the permission that it gives to all Americans of any kind to dream up their own versions of reality and believe them with passionate certainty, to feel the truth about any subject at all. Now, the other English settlers who came at the same time, and who, at least when I went to school, we learned about very little compared to the Pilgrims, they settled in the South and were not such religious zealots at all. Their fantasy was all about getting rich overnight, having been convinced back in England that America was just full of gold and silver and jewels for the plucking. Year after year in Virginia, for decades, from the late 1500s through the early 1600s, they failed to find any gold or silver, and hundreds of them died, and more hundreds, but they kept believing, and despite all evidence to the contrary, kept coming and failing to find gold in Virginia. According to the University of Pennsylvania historian Walter McDougall's excellent history of early America, Freedom Just Around the Corner, quote, most of the 120,000 people who sailed to the South in the 17th century did not know what lay ahead, but were taken in by the propaganda of the sponsors. That is, by the posters and pamphlets and other early advertising that persuaded them that the New World was where they would get rich or find whatever version of utopia they wished. The late great historian Daniel Borstein goes even further than McDougall. He suggests that, in general, quote, American civilization has been shaped by the fact that there was a kind of natural selection here of those people who were willing to believe in advertising. So after a century, New England was becoming less of a theocracy, and in the South, they'd switched from wishing for gold to growing tobacco, but our founding predispositions remained. These manias for extreme religion, for getting rich, and for advertising of all kinds. And a new one that joined those three, for this mania for the various fantasies of entertainment. Now, historians, as many of you know, refer to America's upsurges of extreme supernatural religious fervor, first in the 18th century, then again in the 19th century, as Great Awakenings. But in Fantasyland, I lay out my explanation for how that second Great Awakening in the early 1800s was really just one part of a much larger American embrace of the unprovable and the fantastical and the excitingly untrue. And I call it the Great Delirium. The religious part was real, the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening part, and that ranged from these new uniquely American Protestant churches and offshoots that popped up all over America and especially on the frontiers. Some were believers, jerked and jumped and sobbed and shouted as they felt the Holy Spirit enter them. There were the Shakers who not only shook, but imagined that they communicated directly with heaven. There was the entirely new Christianity of the Church of the Latter-day Saints with its own new additions to the Bible. As Alexis de Tocqueville, who was, of course, the great foreign chronicler of America, wrote about what he found here in the 1830s, there is no country in the whole world in which the Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men than in America. You meet with men full of a fanatical and almost wild enthusiasm, which hardly exists in Europe. Religious insanity is very common in the United States, he said of us then. And also, as nowhere else on earth during the 19th century, traveling, and the 18th century actually, traveling evangelists in America began mixing Christianity with show business and turning religion into a kind of raucous, exciting entertainment, as had not been done before in Christendom. In fact, what emerged in America was a kind of wish and a knack for turning almost anything and everything into show business, such as the new pharmaceutical businesses of the 1800s, which spawned dozens of medicine shows that traveled the country, providing this free live entertainment in small towns and cities all over the country, and especially in the smaller places in America. There were these jamborees of singers and dancers and comedians and magicians. And these shows, these free shows, were interrupted by essentially infomercials, ads for and sales of patent medicines. These cure-alls that cured almost nothing. They were snake oil, and by the way, I don't know if you know it, but snake oil was also one of these patent medicines. And there was a guy in Texas who cut open snakes as part of his medicine show and boiled them and sold it as a cure-all called snake oil. The same time that this was all happening during the Great Delirium in the 1830s, America also invented these cheap, fun, mass market newspapers. And they too pioneered presenting fantasy as reality. This extraordinary week-long series in the New York Sun in 1835 that reported the entirely fictional news that astronomers with this giant new telescope in South Africa had discovered an advanced civilization of flying creatures on the moon. And this was not just a thing that everybody knew was a hoax, and oh, look, it's a hoax. People of the highest education, everyone believed it for a long time, and not just for that week or that month. A year later, people were still convinced that there were the moon was inhabited by Batman, as they were called in this series. This was right when, as well, two founders of what I call the fantasy industrial complex came along. One was this guy, P.T. Barnum, who was one of the first copywriters in the brand new American advertising industry and became one of the first great, among the greatest American show business impresarios. He launched his career as a showman, exhibiting various fictions as facts. In one case, an enslaved woman whom he claimed was George Washington's 162-year-old nanny. Or on another occasion, a stitched-together large half of a fish with a half of an ape, which he claimed was a dead mermaid. He then became a politician, P.T. Barnum, before returning to the more lucrative, or at least more enjoyable profession of show business as the inventor of the modern American circus. The other fantasy industrial complex pioneer of the time was this fellow, William Cody, who became an absolute superstar in mixing fact and fiction for America's and the world's consumption. He was a young civilian scout out in the Great Plains, in the Dakotas, in the Nebraska Territory, Montana, Wyoming, in the wars against the Plains Indians. The media made him famous. He was a character in a dime novel. The newspapers wrote about him, nicknamed him Buffalo Bill, after which, for several years, he started playing himself on the stages in the East in plays written about him. And then he would do that in the winter, and then in the spring and summer, return west to continue fighting and killing Indians. And then Launch decided, okay, I'm getting old, I'm in my 30s, I'm going to just go for the entertainment part, and launched an incredibly successful road show called Buffalo Bill's Wild West. So here you have this actual Western frontiersman and hero morphing into a famous actor, the most famous American probably alive during the late 19th century, who plays a frontiersman on stage sets all over America and the world, well into the age of movies and airplanes and cars. So America was created and built by showmen and their bedazzled audiences, by hucksters and their suckers, by true believers and passionate dreamers, which has made us, Americans today, unusually susceptible to all sorts of fantasies. Now, for most of our history, America had a kind of dynamic equilibrium between the realists and the fantasists, between moderation and mania, between skepticism and credulity and entertainment and reality. For 3 centuries, in culture and religion and politics and economics, the fantasist and realist impulses existed in a rough balance with a powerful, energizing tension between those two. And that dynamic balance, I think, was key. America was like a giant internal combustion engine, this machine powered by endless little explosions, like your car engine, every wild vision and every dreamy ambition allowed to ignite, but with control mechanisms, with carburetors and gaskets and a sturdy engine block, all keeping this contraption, this great American contraption, from blowing apart, such as the U.S. Senate, which was invented to be the sober check on the crazed House of Representatives, and the Electoral College, designed to be this sober, wise group with a final say on who got to be president in case the people elected a charlatan or a demagogue, a man who, as Alexander Hamilton said as they were drafting the Constitution, would have talents for low intrigue and the little arts of popularity. That's what the Electoral College was meant to prevent. Over time, over these centuries, various extreme religious sects emerged, but then calmed as they grew and matured. We submitted our faith in free markets to constraints so that the system was fair enough to keep operating successfully. Conspiracy hysterias of various kinds arose, but they, until recently, seldom lasted very long and disappeared. So, dream the impossible dream, build it and they will come, put the pedal to the metal, but play by the rules and don't drink and drive. That was how it worked. And yes, being an American always meant having a chip on your shoulder about the elitists and the know-it-alls, but when push came to shove, the people who actually knew important things remained in control, and most of the time it worked okay. But then little by little, and I think during the last half century, importantly, more and more and faster, Americans have given ourselves over to all kinds of magical thinking and relativism where anything goes, and belief in fanciful explanation, and in small and large fantasies that console us or thrill us or terrify us. For instance, more than any other of the 2 billion people in the rich world, Americans really believe in the supernatural and miraculous, in demons among us, in the reports of people going and returning from heaven to heaven recently, and so forth. At the turn of this century, and it's not just spiritual and New Age and religious belief I'm talking about, the turn of this century, the financial industry encouraged the fantasy that risky debt was no longer risky. So many non-rich Americans believed they could live beyond their means, given our fantasy that real estate would always and only increase in value. We fantasize that the government and its co-conspirators are hiding all kinds of terrible truths from us concerning extraterrestrials and how AIDS started and how the 9/11 attacks occurred and who was behind them and the dangers of vaccines and so many more. We stockpile guns partly because we fantasize about our pioneer past or in anticipation of imaginary shootouts with thugs and terrorists. How widespread is this promiscuous devotion to the unlikely and untrue? I poured through reams of research from the last 20 years and assembled what I think is a rough but more or less accurate census of this kind of American belief and delusion. I think that the more or less solidly reality-based are probably a minority, maybe a third of us, but almost certainly no more than half. Only a third of us, for instance, believe with some certainty that CO2 emissions from cars and factories are the main cause of Earth's warming. Only a third are sure that the tale of creation in Genesis is not a literal, factual account of the creation of the earth and life. On the other hand, more than a third of us believe not only that global warming is no big deal, but that it's a hoax perpetrated by a conspiracy of scientists, government, and journalists. A third believe in angels and demons among us today. And a third believe that the pharmaceutical industry has, in league with the government, hidden evidence of all kinds of natural cancer cures. A quarter believe that vaccines cause autism, that Donald Trump won the popular vote, that our previous president was the Antichrist, that the media or the government, quote, adds secret mind-controlling technology to TV broadcast signals, that witches are real, that U.S. officials in the Bush administration planned the 9/11 attacks. Now, when I say that a third believes fantasy X or a quarter believe fantasy Y, falsehood Y, it's important to understand and remember, for those of you who have or haven't taken statistics, that those are different quarters and thirds of the U.S. population. Various fantasy constituencies overlap and feed each other. For instance, an important one is that belief in extraterrestrial abduction, which spiked significantly starting in the 1990s, leads to a general belief in vast government cover-ups, which can lead to belief in still more wide-ranging plots and cabals, which can jive and be reinforced by a belief in imminent Christian Armageddon. It is no coincidence, then, that Alex Jones delivers crazy conspiracy theories and advertises quack medicines. Fantasyland operates, I think, kind of like the European Union. You know, it's this collection of independent domains, but it makes it very easy to travel freely among the various domains. So why are we like this? And the shortest answer is because we're Americans, and because, as I've explained, being American has always meant believing any damn thing we want, that our beliefs are equal or superior to anyone else's, notwithstanding whatever experts believe. Once people really commit to that approach, and I mean seriously commit to it, as I think more and more have the last few decades, the world turns inside out and there's no more cause and effect connection, and the credible becomes incredible and the incredible becomes credible. And so the word mainstream has been turned into a pejorative. It didn't used to be, young people. Shorthand for bias and lies and oppression by the elites. Yet, that hated mainstream, the establishment, the institutions and forces that used to keep us from overdoing the flagrantly untrue or absurd in this country, media and academia and politics, government, religion, corporate America, professional associations, respectable opinion taken in together, over the last few decades have really, in my view, fallen down on the job and enabled every species of fantasy to flourish. What do we have today? A senior physician at one of America's most prestigious university hospitals promotes miracle cures on his daily TV shows. Major cable channels air documentaries treating mermaids, monsters, ghosts, and angels as real. A CNN anchor speculated on the air that the disappearance of that Malaysian airliner was a supernatural event. State legislatures pass resolutions to resist the imaginary threat of Islamic law. The irrational has become respectable and sometimes unstoppable. And the problem is, one of the problems is that as particular fantasies get traction and become contagious, other fantasists are encouraged by the kind of cascade of out-of-control tolerance. It's like a twisted golden rule where people think, well, if those people believe that, then why can't I believe this? Our whole social environment and each of its overlapping parts have become conducive to spectacular fallacy and make-believe. And there are lots and lots of slippery slopes leading in various directions to other exciting nonsense. My argument, though, extends way beyond clear-cut, fact-checkable untruths. America, this transformation that I'm talking about, really clicked into focus for me when I stepped back and broadened my field of vision. I saw that the proliferation of delusions and illusions concerning these large subjects that people have always disagreed about and debated, politics, religion, even science, is connected to the glut of entertaining fictional and quasi-fictional things that course through our everyday life that we don't even necessarily see as fictional. So what I call Fantasyland is not only a matter of factual falsehoods that are fervently believed, but also of people assembling, as they never have to this degree, make-believe lifestyles. Both kinds of these fantasies, on the one hand, conspiracy theories or pseudoscience or belief in various forms of magic, and on the other hand, things like fantasy sports and cosplay. Nothing wrong with fantasy sports or cosplay. But all of them make everyday existence more exciting and dramatic. And so on the way from the Pilgrims and other Puritans through the 1800s, before we got to where we are now, the modern tipping points for both of those types of fantasy were the result, I think, of the same two momentous changes that happened in the last 50 years. The first was the profound shift in thinking that swelled up during the 1960s. In 1961, right after TV had become ubiquitous, part of this long journey toward Fantasyland, and Disneyland had opened, the historian Daniel Borstein published a brilliant, prescient book called The Image, A Guide to Pseudo-Events in America. He wrote that we risk being the first people in history to have been able to make their illusions so vivid, so persuasive, so realistic that they can live in them. And that since we inhabit a, quote, world where fantasy is more real than reality, our national politics has become a competition for images or between images rather than between ideals. There is no way to mask and there's no way to unmask an image. An image, like any other pseudo-event, becomes all the more interesting with our every effort to debunk it. He was saying this in 1961, not in 2018. He nailed post-truth, what we now call post-truth America, more than a half a century before we used that phrase. Now, our popular understanding of the 1960s is skewed. And I think I try in Fantasyland to give it larger context and results of what happened in the 1960s. People on the left focus on legacies that people on the left define as progress, civil rights and women's rights and environmentalism and so on. And people on the political and cultural right have still tend to demonize the decade as the source of the things they hate. In fact, what the left and right respectively love and hate about the 60s are mostly flip sides of the same coin. Yes, all the countercultural Woodstocky notions did explode in the late 1960s and 70s. But what people don't register today in the idea of the 60s and how it's been packaged and sold to us ever since is that as well as Woodstock Nation, what also exploded then were extreme Christianity and reflexive conspiracism and survivalism and libertarianism and so much more that do not fit in the character of what the 60s were all about. Anything goes meant that anything goes, that every individual was freer in every way to believe whatever he or she wished. In the 60s and after the 60s, the idea that finally eclipsed all the competing ideas in the American mix was extreme individualism. So that during and after the 1960s, equality, good thing, right? Equality came to include the idea that your beliefs about anything are as true as anyone else's and nobody can tell you different. At the end of the decade and the peak of what we think of as the 60s, two books came out that defined and promoted this big new idea that whatever you felt was true. And that reason and rationality were pretty much over and antiquated. This one came out just weeks after the Woodstock Festival and coined the term counterculture right there in its title. It was a bestseller. Then, not long after, this one, The Greening of America, an excerpt from this book filled an entire issue of the New Yorker magazine in the fall of 1970, and the book became the largest bestseller of any book in America in 1970. Now, the authors of both of these were professors, one in San Francisco, the other at Yale, and during the 1960s and 70s, large swaths of academia was making a sharp turn away from reason and science as they had been understood. The new paradigm had it that reason and science are just stories made up by the powers that be, not so different from fables and superstitions and religious tales. Furthermore, this new idea had it, reality itself is a social construction, a collection of myths that members of society have been persuaded to believe. Consensus reality was a phrase coined then. But a great irony looking back now is that the believe or disbelieve whatever you want, this ethos that emerged out of the cultural left on campus and elsewhere during the 1960s has actually ended up powering today's political right much more than the left. Until the 1960s, fantastical conspiracy theories were mostly limited to the fringes. But then after the murders of President Kennedy and his brother Robert when he was running for president and Martin Luther King, many, many more Americans by the end of the 60s had become inclined to believe in all sorts of conspiracies and cover-ups to explain anything that they found wrong or bad in society. The 60s were also when many, many more Americans began to think that they had seen a flying saucer, or as started then and peaked a couple of decades later, or shot up a couple of decades later, had been abducted by aliens. The 1990s, which I have a chapter called The X-Filing of America, came after a generation post-60s of the fantasy industrial complex, media and entertainment, and even distinguished professors at Harvard and MIT getting in on this idea of extraterrestrial abduction and fairly wild conspiracy theories. So the X-Files, the television show, was one of the most successful shows on television in the 90s. It was entertainment, of course. It was scripted entertainment, but it also truly encouraged 30 million people a week who watched it to really believe in conspiracies, in the existence of the sorts of all-powerful conspiracies involving extraterrestrials and the U.S. government and so forth that the show trucked in. These were some of its taglines. I want to believe to understand, trust no one, and they were among the founding principles of what I call Fantasyland. Now, at the same time, in the 1990s, came the second big modern change that enabled Fantasyland, digital technology, which empowers real-seeming fictions of both kinds, the lifestyle and entertainment kind, as well as the political and pseudoscientific kind. Among the 1 billion websites that exist today, believers, of course, in anything and everything can now easily find thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of fellow fantasists who share their beliefs, along with tons of pseudo-facts to back those beliefs up. Before the internet, that really wasn't possible or as easy, and crackpots were mostly isolated and had a harder time remaining alone, convinced of their alternate realities. And internet search was designed to be democratic, small d, in the extreme. which means that as a result, Gresham's law often operates in internet search, the bad driving out the good. The prominence of Google that Google gives, or any search engine gives, to any assertion or belief or theory depends on the preferences of billions of individual searchers. Every click on a link, trillions of them a year, is a vote, essentially, pushing that version of the truth toward the top of the pile of results. And exciting falsehoods tend to do well in that perpetual referendum and become self-validating as a result. For instance, when I search for government extraterrestrial cover-up, the first 3 pages of Google results include only one result that does not link to an article endorsing a conspiracy theory about extraterrestrial cover-ups. Computers also make fantasies that we mostly understand to be fantasies seem much more authentic. Game worlds in which we can persuasively and immersively pretend we're anybody or anything from any time or any galaxy. But we can also become exciting fictionalized versions of our actual selves online. Real people interacting anonymously with other real people in fantastical or vicious ways that a short time ago we would never have dreamed of doing. Now, each of these small fantasies, and as I say, and simulations, some of which are perfectly benign and in which we all engage, that we insert in our lives, are harmless enough by themselves, replacing this little piece of reality or this little bit of mundane existence here, this one over there. But over time, and over these last several decades, these patches of unreality take up more and more space. And we stop registering the differences between simulated and authentic, and between real and unreal. In the old days, if you wanted a shot at becoming instantly rich, you had to go to Las Vegas. If you wanted to wander around realistically make-believe places, you had to go to Disneyland. But now, those experiences are ubiquitous. They're everywhere in America. Back in the day, theme was not a verb. Pornographic fantasies were not ubiquitous. We had not yet fabricated this mongrel of documentary, pseudo-documentary and melodrama that we call reality TV. Cosmetic surgery was rare. Old men did not dye their hair a bright blonde, especially if they were president of the United States. Of course, having a facelift or playing League of Legends does not make any individual more inclined to believe that, she needs a dozen AR-15s for self-defense, or that vaccines cause autism. But we are all freer than ever to custom make our realities, to believe whatever, or to pretend to be whomever we wish, which makes all the lines between the actual and the fictional start to blur and disappear more easily. Truth, in general, becomes more fungible and a matter of personal preference, flexible. There is a functioning synergy among our multiplying fantasies, the toxic ones and the individually entertaining ones. Scientists warn, about the cocktail effect concerning chemicals in the environment or drugs in your brain where various different substances, as they say, potentiate the other substances. I think it's kind of like that. We have been drinking this bottomless American cocktails mixed from all the different fantasy ingredients, the conscious and semi-conscious and unconscious fantasies, and each of them can intensify the effects of the others. Thomas Jefferson tried hard to adhere to reason. One winter in the White House 215 years ago, he cut up copies of the New Testament, removed all references to miracles, including Christ's resurrection, and pasted it all back together, and entitled this new version of the New Testament that he created, The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, the one great book that Jefferson wrote and published also addressed religion. He was advocating that the new American government that they were about to create had to lay off religion, let it be, and let people believe whatever, because, this is Jefferson, quoting Jefferson, "It does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." That is a line I love, because that is the essence of American tolerance. So what if lots of my fellow citizens have, according to me, various screws loose? So what if they stew in what I consider their own mad dream worlds? Ignore them. Let them be. That's what America has always done. The problem, however, is when delusional ideas and magical thinking flood into the public sphere and become so pervasive and deeply rooted that they affect us all. Some fantasies have become weaponized, literally. In other words, pockets are being picked and legs are being broken, for instance, by fantasies involving guns and fantasies denying the science concerning climate change and vaccines and GMOs and more. And speaking of subverting science, just consider one bit of it, evolutionary biology. Now, what I consider, she felt that the Christian fundamentalists were taking over her party that she'd voted for presidents for 14 times in a row in. That happened gradually in the 1980s and 90s, but then in the end, very quickly, like a phase change when a liquid turns to a gas. So just a decade ago, in 2008, when all of the Republican presidential candidates were on a debate stage and asked by the moderator, do you believe in evolution? 3/4 of them said yes. In the next election cycle, 2012, only 1/3 were willing to say that, yeah, biology has that right. And last time, in 2016, only one Republican candidate dared to say that evolution is real. The only one who didn't was poor Jeb Bush, and who then, in fact, backpedaled, adding that he believes it, but it doesn't need to be taught in the schools, and that if it were, creationism should be taught in the public schools alongside it. Now, the United States has been politically polarized many, many times before. This is not new, but I think what we're going through now is new and more profound than what has happened before, because we're becoming epistemologically polarized. These different versions of reality that are incompatible, and tens of millions of people mixing up fact and fiction, and these large factions of America embracing these distinctly different versions of reality, making it hard to run a country and have a society. So to finish up, here's my summary of how we got here. Mix extreme anti-establishment individualism with extreme religion, mix show business with everything else, let all that steep and simmer for a few centuries, run it through anything goes 1960s and the internet age, voila, the America we inhabit today. Now, it's an America where Rudy Giuliani, one of the chief spokesmen for the President of the United States, has said during just the last couple of months that, quote, the truth is relative, and facts are in the eye of the beholder, and truth isn't truth. And a place where reality and fantasy are so weirdly and I think dangerously blurred and commingled in a way they haven't ever been before. And I say dangerously. I am not, and I have not been in my life, in my work, an hysteric. I'm a calm optimist by and large. But I read Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt, as many of you know, escaped Nazi Germany as a young woman, became a great political philosopher here in America, published her first big book in 1951 when Hitler was just gone and Stalin was still running the Soviet Union. It's called The Origins of Totalitarianism. I read it for the first time in 2016, and much of it just shocked me in its relevance and resonance today. One paragraph in particular gave me goosebumps, and I'm going to read you the whole thing. In an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses reach the point where they would, she's talking about Nazism, fascism, Soviet totalitarianism, where the masses would, at the same time, believe everything and nothing, think that everything was possible and nothing was true. The totalitarian mass leaders based their propaganda on the correct psychological assumption that, under such conditions, one could make people believe the most fantastic statements one day and trust that if the next day they were given irrefutable proof of their falsehood, they would take refuge in cynicism. Instead of deserting the leaders who had lied to them, they would protest that they had known all along that the statement was a lie and would admire the leaders for their superior tactical cleverness. As I've said, our post-fact Fantasyland tendencies were present from the beginning, but this current situation was not inevitable, because history and evolution are never inevitable, nor is any particular future inevitable now. We're at a crossroads, I think, and we have choices to make. It's perfectly plausible that we regain our national balance and composure that was operative for so many centuries, that these last decades turn out to have been a phase, a kind of unfortunate episode in the American experiment that we'll move past and chalk up to experience. Nations and societies of various kinds, we could name them, have survived and recovered from far more terrible swerves. So the good news that I have to give, such as it is that America may now be at peak Fantasyland, and let us hope so. Thank you very much. And I would be happy to take any questions or comments or have arguments with you or whatever you'd like. Make it that. Thank you.
Maybe I'll start it off. So one of the rare contributions of Americans to philosophy is pragmatism. And that's also part of our history, that pragmatic strand in American thinking. And there's a strong natural selection bias for people who live in reality. At some point, reality brings down those who don't live in reality.
Yes, as we saw in 2008.
Exactly.
For instance.
And so why shouldn't we be a little more optimistic about where we're at with our culture?
I would love to be. And of course, part of a grand part of American character and the national character has been an optimism. We'll see, partly because, I mean, economics, free market economics is a place where you cannot escape into fantasy for very long because, as you say, reality slaps you. So, and it did slap us in 2008, 2009. We'll see. One thing we don't know is this profoundly new set of technologies that allows what I would consider to be immersion in fantastical silos of facts and pseudo-facts and fantasies is not something we're only 20 years into it, right? So, I'd like to be optimistic that it will self-correct and so forth, but once I started looking at the history of this and how deep-seated and wide-ranging this default to the excitingly untrue we have in our character, combined with the present day, and especially technology and the kind of the extreme individualism that came out of the 60s, I don't know. I mean, I'm not certain that we're goners and that this isn't, and I do have great hope that, okay, reality will reassert itself in various ways, and this is as far as we're going to go, and maybe it's just a longer cycle. I've always been there are all kinds of cyclical histories of America, the Schlesingers and others have posed, and I've always wanted to believe those, and they look, you can see how that works. We go back and forth in pendulums. This has been a long one, and I just worry that the conditions, technologically and otherwise, that it may be different this time. That's all, and I don't know. I am, and as I say, I've been a hopeful person, and I've never taken seriously the various, oh my God, we're going to hell, it's the end of civilization, we're just like the Roman Empire. I've never been one of those people, and I'm not saying that the end is near, and this is the end of the great American experiment, but it has seemed possible to me for the first time.
Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Andersen. It was super informative and intriguing. So it makes me wonder a lot, like you say, Americans' history is very cyclical. And alongside this religious fanaticism that evolved over the past few centuries has always been this fear of the other that has resulted in a fear and a discrimination towards immigrants and people who are not native. So I'm just wondering if you believe that to be a cause or a symptom of this fantasy land.
I think it overlaps slightly, but I think it's probably a separate thing. One of my novels is set in the 1840s, and so I did a lot of reading of contemporaneous newspapers and pamphlets and so forth of how the Irish were regarded in the 1840s. I mean, I was stunned at the viciousness and the bigotry and the vitriol that was there then, and I suppose it's connected. So I think it's a tribal fear of the other and the whatever. They don't have to be, in that case, they don't have to be non-white to be scary and terrible in the eyes of certain natives. So I think it's connected in that instance. There were all kinds of fantasies, and had been for 50 years earlier, before there was any Irish influx. These fantasies about the Vatican conspiracy to ruin America and destroy the Republic and all that. So they connect. There are untruths and fantasies, but you see the kinds of opposition that happens to immigrants is happening against immigrants in Europe, and it doesn't look that different to me than what we have here. So connected, but I would say, but not born directly of this instinct of ours to believe the wacky or the delusional. Yes. Hey.
Thank you again. Wonderful talk. Well, I can't disagree that there are some stretching of truths going on. I listen to the news. I read the newspaper. The world I live in mostly is involved in a movement called evidence-based medicine. And so doctors make recommendations
Here's to you for
based on evidence.
Yes.
People in agriculture are careful to make recommendations that will have solid science behind them, that this will improve your production. So what we are looking at here another example of our polarization as a society, and can we educate ourselves out of it?
Well, no, and evidence-based medicine, I write a lot in the book about medicine and how evidence-based medicine, I mean, we used to think all medicine was evidence-based, right? But that phrase and that idea grew up, as you know, in great measure in opposition to, I believe, therefore it's true medicine. And so it is connected to political polarization, but it's not the same as, because, some of my, many of my, at least 10 years ago, my liberal friends in Los Angeles and New York were not vaccinating their children. So that's not a question of political polarization. I think the demonization of GMOs is extreme and ridiculous, and an idea that is embraced mainly by the left, not exclusively, but mainly. So it's not the same as, but can we get out of it by education? I mean, I don't know that. I don't have a silver bullet or magical solution, but yes, education. I have to go around and give talks. You guys have to go around and give talks. Or go to talks, or read the newspaper, or be involved in evidence-based medicine. Whatever it is in your life, and raising your children and your grandchildren correctly. I mean, we are all responsible for doing this, to the degree that the public education system is also partly responsible. Sure, yes, but I don't think we can say, yeah, the schools should take care of this problem, because they can't and they won't, because so much of what I'm talking about happens outside the schools. And again, as I've gone around the country talking about this book, and teachers come to many of my talks and say, usually they don't stand up and say it, sometimes they do, but often to me privately, like, yeah, I try to do this, and then I get in trouble when parents say, why are you teaching my kid this thing that we in our family don't believe? So it's rough, but yeah, I think our schools do have a responsibility for teaching critical thinking and the facts when about important things like medicine and climate change and the rest. Yeah, sure. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I kind of wanted to go back to the first question that we opened up with related to your optimism. I really appreciate your optimism, but at the same time, I'm trying to sort through kind of how I'm trying to interpret what's going on in the world right now. And Yasha Monk, who's a contemporary political scientist,
he's a great political scientist. Yeah.
Is more on the alarmist end
Yes.
of the spectrum. And I recently read his book, The People versus Democracy. And so I'm trying to kind of interpret, the things that you're saying kind of with the things that he's saying, where he's kind of looking at basically the fragility of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism in countries that have been democratic. And so I'm curious kind of how you take in things like that into your perspective, and really ultimately what you think are kind of maybe the 2 or 3 things that are most important for us to focus on when we're kind of dealing with these issues.
Thank you for calling me optimistic. I don't think that would be your impression if you read this book. But on the other hand, many people do read it and say, "Wow, really disturbing." But it was kind of reassuring that we've always been this way. I mean, I could have gone on and on in the book and don't about the threat to what I agree with Yasha Monk about the fragility of democracy and the threats to it, and that long Hannah Arendt quote is as far and close as I go to that, really. But no, and it's important to look as she does in that book, and maybe Monk does and other writers do as well. To what degree, just in Nazi Germany, the embrace of astrology and various kinds of magical thinking, not to mention taking lots and lots of psychoactive drugs. I mean, there are the fantasy land of Weimar and Nazi Germany is another thing that leaves me gasping for and trying to resist the parallels. As I said when I began, I mean, I don't want this federal policy that the Republican Party wants. Fine, we can disagree with that. We always have. I'd rather have this judge than this judge on the Supreme Court. Fine, we can disagree with that. We always have. But this other thing that is new, which is to say, I'm going to say whatever I wish to believe, and if you are with me, my fellow partisans, you must agree that that lie is not a lie. That is indeed, as Hannah Arendt and others have said, part of what authoritarians and anti-non-democrats, that's part of the playbook, and that is where it becomes. That's why I have, just in the last couple of years, reached out and have become close to and fonder of friends and new friends on the right who understand, who shares with me that very fear. So what can we focus on? I mean, I really do think we can focus on the common ground of people who are in the reality-based community. Because I'm happy to have arguments with people who disagree with me about what the proper way to deal with problem X or issue Y are, immigration, or any of the most contentious issues. It's just when we don't share a set of common facts that I don't see a future for this democracy. So that's I don't have 3 things. I have that thing that we have to make clear that for all of our tribalism and all that if we've disagreed before, we've been polarized before, but different sides play hardball in different ways in politics and all that. It's a good faith agreement that, okay, here's the facts, right? We agree on these facts. I mean, I was a kid during Vietnam, and it's not, and there was vicious, violent, vituperative, and other V words, anger and disagreement over Vietnam, but it wasn't as though, nope, there aren't 500,000 Americans fighting there. There's only 100,000. There was no disagreement about the facts. There were disagreement about interpretations. Well, will communism go beyond Vietnam? Is there a domino effect? Okay, those are things to disagree about. But when you disagree about the fundamental facts of science or geopolitical reality or finance or whatever, that's the problem to me. And if we can get past that, then we can go back to normal democratic disagreement about how we ought to, whether or not we ought to have universal health care or not. But we just can't. We're going to get stopped if we have these different versions of reality. And when one of these two sclerotic parties is in power, one set of facts is operative, and when the other one is in power, this other set of facts is operative. That's the end of democracy as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, okay, quick. Oh, you first.
Students first.
You first.
All right, if you're sure. My name's Carmen. I'm a reporter at the Daily Evergreen. Thank you so much for being here.
Sure, thank you.
You talked a little bit about how the media and academia, science institutions used to sort of be the underlying reality in Fantasyland, but now they've kind of come to perpetuate this idea.
Right.
So I was wondering what you think the media's role is specifically in getting back to reality-based thinking.
Well, I mean, it depends what you mean by the media. If you mean the news media, if you include entertainment, then like the History Channel should stop running documentaries about mermaids, for instance. That would be a thing. But in terms of the news media, take Fox News. I would have no problem at all. It'd be great if Fox News were a conservative channel that adhered to journalistic standards about factual reality. Fine. But when you have a character like Sean Hannity doing what he does for an hour a night, that's a different thing. So that's one thing. I mean, the cows have left the barn of the news media of my childhood when everybody was supposed to be objective and nobody had opinions. That's done. But having opinions is one thing, and having this sort of alternate facts is another. So that's one. I think, and I don't think it's so much up to the, in that case, it is up to the media, because there's an owner that could say, okay, this is a new set of rules, we've gone too far, this is the kind of conservative channel we're going to be. Otherwise, I would say it's up to people, it's up to the consumers of media and buyers of media, readers and listeners, to choose the reality-based news media and reject the news media that are not reality-based, whether or not they happen to agree with your opinions. To me, left conspiracy nuts are as atrocious, every bit as atrocious as right ones, more so, because they're on my side of things. So, but what the media can do, I don't. I don't think they're doing such a bad job, and even the conservative media is not doing such a bad job, with a few exceptions, like Sean Hannity and so forth. So I think it's important for nonpartisan, non-ideological news media to continue to exist. I think that's hugely important, and to call a spade and call them like they see them, regardless of if the news that they report serves their side of things or not. I think that's important. I think if and when we go to where, as it was, by the way, back in the 1800s, if we get to a place where all journalism and all news media is partisan, that would be very sad and wrong. And so I would say it's up to the mainstream in the sense of not having an ideological tilt, news media to redouble that effort. Sure. Okay.
So I noticed a lot of similarities between The Lies My Teacher Told Me and your book. Did The Lies My Teacher Told Me influence?
I never read it. I know of the book, but no. So no, it didn't influence me, but thank you.
And okay, it was good. And second, do you have any feel for how well fantasy takes hold in, say, China, as a comparison?
It's an interesting question. I mean, in some ways, certainly in some ways, less. I would say I would say that is not their big problem. I mean, they've got big problems, and I wouldn't want to live there. But to the degree I've looked at it, certainly in like everywhere else in the developed world, they are much less religious. So the religious fantasies aren't an issue much in China. And in fact, it seems to me that part of what the reformation of China that happened starting in the 80s and 90s was an abandonment of the communist fantasy, really, in favor of, an authoritarian free marketism. So I mean, do they have fantasies about revenge for their century of humiliation? No doubt, but not the kind of denial of scientific and geopolitical reality that I worry about Americans falling prey to. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. You can't leave him. Yeah. Right.
No, of course not. I had a longer, more serious question about the role of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories interwoven into this larger Fantasyland context.
Yeah.
But given the time we have left, I'll settle for knowing whether it was you or Gray who came up with short-fingered vulgarian.
Was that no? It was, and no, the anti-Semitic part of, it's when everything is up for grabs and nothing, everything, nothing is any longer unsayable, whether it's racist or anti-Semitic. That's some dangerous territory. We came up with Short-Fingered Vulgarian together. He, this is my partner in creating Spy Magazine. He, right when we were creating Spy Magazine, went and did a profile of Donald Trump, this first big GQ magazine profile, and came back from the office to our little office, or came back from doing that to our little office and said, this guy Donald Trump, for a big man, he's got the smallest fingers I've ever seen in my life. That was it. It was like an empirical observation, and it wasn't like a diss on his manhood, or it was just like, God, the guy has little fingers for a 6'2" guy. And so then when we were coming up with epithets for him, as we did for various people we covered regularly in the magazine, to use again and again and again, just because we thought it was funny. We had several that we tried and rejected, they never stuck, and then as soon as we together came up with Short-Fingered Vulgarian, it just stuck and still pisses him off, He still writes letters to Graydon saying, no, look, my fingers are long. He does. And so proving that, thin skin's a good thing when you're doing satire, But anyway, thanks for making it simple.
Hello, Tamaraya Tower, the Twin Towers, Pullman DOD brat, born rights to American Achievement Team. Why do you not tell these people about the blood book, the A to Z diseases, and raw foods where...
Anyway, thanks. Yeah, casting an actress to come in and do that at the end, very good move.
Thank you for the
Hi,
great talk,
thank you,
sir.
thank you.
I've been reading your book.